Everyone knows that politicians and people in power in America, at least, have used the Bible to try to manipulate votes and push through their agendas. But are there any surprising ways that the Bible has been leveraged by politicians in recent and in older history? And what might all of that mean for how we think about the intersection of the Bible and faith and politics today? Well, that's what Kaitlyn Schiess's new book, The Ballot and the Bible, is all about. Let me tell you what I thought of it. Welcome to Books and Big Ideas, what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, with Joel Wentz. Okay, I have here a copy of The Ballot and the Bible, a new book from Brazos Press, written by Kaitlyn Schiess. I want to say thank you to Brazos for giving me a review copy of the book. So let's get into some of my thoughts on it. I'm going to take you through my main format of my summary of the main idea, the research behind the book, the readability of its style, and then my reaction to it as a whole. So let's dive in. Okay, so the main idea of the Ballot and the Bible is, I would say, if I had to categorize it, I would more firmly categorize it in history, or a work of, historiography, as opposed to it's not as much about exegeting scripture. It's not even as much about political theology. So if you're expecting one of those other things, know that this really is primary history. It does get into those others. She does exegete passages, like she does some work with Jeremiah 29, for example. She does work with Romans 13, which I'll say more about in a second. But it's really, really like the center of gravity of the book is history. American history specifically. So that's kind of the one first thing to know about the main idea. But what she does with this book basically is she goes through American history, and it's kind of a survey in a way of important moments in kind of turning points in American history, you could say. And she takes each moment and then does a survey of how was scripture utilized in this particular slice of history by pastors, preachers, politicians, people in power. How was scripture used to argue certain points of public policy or theology or ideologies? How does scripture kind of intersect with these conversations that were happening in these slices of American history? And she goes from John Winthrop's City on a Hill, which, she goes into how the history of that's kind of been received since that. But that's the 17th century, 1600s speech. She starts there, so pre-Revolutionary era, starts there, and then goes to the Revolutionary War, and then goes through what you'd expect, the Civil War. She goes through civil rights, and then she gets in, there's maybe numerically more chapters in more recent history than the older history. But that's what she does. She skips through these kind of slices of history, looks at how the Bible was leveraged by people in that moment, and then teases out some kind of application kind of thoughts about what does this look at history have to bear, how does this bear on how we think about the use of scripture in our moment in terms of political discussions and public policy and all of that. So that's the main idea of the Ballot Bible. It's mostly history, which if you're a history person, that's great news, right? If you're going into it expecting it to be much more political theology, you might be surprised to see that it's much more about history. Okay, let me keep moving here. So the research behind this now. Now, in terms of the categories that I discuss when I review books like this, in my categories, if I had to give like the highest rating in a certain category to this book, it would definitely be in the research. I thought the research was excellent, superb. It really impressed me. It really, really impressed me. And what I mean is that she's read a zillion books. It's really impressive. I'm someone who reads a lot. I have a YouTube channel about how much I love reading and the books that I like. And I still was really, really amazed at how much she has read, especially of books. It's not only books. She's read, periodicals and articles and that academic publications, that kind of stuff too. But what's even more impressive than just the sheer number of books is the breadth of books that she brings to kind of the evidence that she marshals for making these historical claims. So, and it's especially impressive because of the wide swath of history that she gets to in this book, and because it's a pretty thin book. Like when I held it up, I don't know if you could tell, it's not very thick. I think it's under 200 pages maybe, but she's read a lot on each slice of history she gets into. So she's read a lot on the social gospel. There's a chapter on the social gospel movement. She's read a lot on the Revolutionary War and how pastors and preachers were talking then. That's one of my favorite chapters. I'll say more about that in a minute. She's read a lot. There's a chapter on kind of rapture, dispensationalist eschatology in like the 70s and 80s. She's read a lot of stuff about the effect of dispensationalism on fiction and popular culture. I mean, each chapter, it's really remarkable. It's like each chapter kind of produces a mini treasure trove of books that Kaitlyn Schiess has sorted through and like culled through and pulled a lot of their insights into the chapter that's kind of relevant to the topic that she's discussing. And I was really impressed, honestly, very, very impressed at the amount of research and kind of the command of the literature that she is demonstrating in this book. So, yeah, in terms of, like I said, the categories I look at, research just through the roof on this one. Really, really impressive. Great kind of command of the literature, representation of different arguments, which is very effective for what she's trying to do in this book, which is to try to have kind of a broad look across the political spectrum at how people leveraged scripture in different moments in history. So, yeah, props to her for her really, really impressive research. Okay, let me move a little bit quicker now, going to these next two things. I'm not going to say a lot about the readability because it's very readable. It's right in the line of, I think, a lot of what Brazos puts out, which is academically rooted. There's a lot of research behind it, but the actual presentation of the argument is very accessible, I would say. The book as a whole is not very long. The chapters themselves are not overly long, which always helps with readability. And the history angle on it, if you're a American history person, you're going to find this eminently readable because she's commenting on really well-known chapters of history, but bringing kind of insights into those like the Civil War, for example, or civil rights, or, like I mentioned, the Revolutionary War chapter has a fascinating discussion of the leverage of the text Romans chapter 13, which I mentioned a minute ago. Romans 13, that famous or infamous text about submitting to the governing authorities, how that was used by preachers in the Revolutionary era is very surprising. And if you're a history person, you're going to really, really enjoy the insights that come in some of these chapters. The chapter that compares, well, I'm getting a little ahead of myself into my reaction, but I'll just say that the chapter that compares Obama and George W. Bush in the ways they leverage scripture might also be quite surprising to people, even if you're a historical, kind of well-read person. So all that to say, the readability is good. It's accessible. It does what it needs to do. I think it's something that you could give to somebody who doesn't necessarily read a ton. They're not going to be put off by the length. They're not going to be put off by the style. It makes the argument very, very effectively and pretty winsomely, I would say. Okay. Now, my reaction to this book. You can tell my reaction is positive. The research was amazing. It's very, very well done. And when I, as a reader, a person who loves books, when I read a book like this, part of what I'm paying attention to is the work behind it, because I'm interested in reading more if there's something that sparks my interest. And I have to say, like, not only did she read a ton of books, but she's dug up a lot of books that I was not familiar with, even as a big reader. And so I'm going to be diving through her works cited, and I'm excited to dig into some more stuff in the certain chapters of history that I'm especially interested in. So that's a huge plus in terms of my reaction to this book. I found it also, when you get a good, if you read a lot of books, you know what this feels like. But when you have a good sense that the person really did some work to make this argument, you kind of inherently trust the voice a little bit more, and I think she's a very trustworthy voice. A couple other things I want to comment on about what I liked. I liked that she's very even-handed. I think that she really does a good job in these certain slices of history, saying, like, here's some arguments that existed, here's some counter-arguments that existed, here's how they might resonate or not resonate with arguments that we're having today. The chapter on the kind of neoliberal age of the market, she has a whole chapter on the Reagan-Thatcher era emergence of kind of free market economics, and importantly for her book, how was the Bible used to support certain economic arguments or argue against them, people like Ron Sider, so on and so forth. She does a great job in that book, or in that chapter, at handling the back and forth between those arguments. Same with the social gospel chapter. I think she does a really even-handed job. So if you're a raging partisan, you're going to be frustrated at points in this, but if you're at all, and I would say if you're at all a person who tries to have even-keeled approach to political arguments, to policy arguments, you are, I think, going to appreciate the stance that she takes, because I felt like it was very even-handed. If you're someone who's disillusioned with the hardcore polarization and partisanship in our day, you're gonna love her voice. So those are a lot of things I liked about it. I don't have much to say by way of critique. The only thing that I kind of walked away with when I put the book down was I wondered if there were slices of history that were missing. I was thinking about someone like a William Jennings Bryan, who overlaps a bit with the social gospel movement, but she doesn't discuss him. But as a political figure who leveraged the Bible in his work, I think a chapter on him would be really, really interesting. There's not really much on figures like Billy Graham and how they intersected with people like Richard Nixon and some of the political maneuvering that was happening with the neo-evangelical movement in the post-World War II era. There's actually not a lot about World War II, really, even, which is kind of interesting. So it's not a critique per se, but it is just to say that I think with the effort to keep the book as trim and as slim and as accessible as it is, I think stuff had to be put on the cutting room floor. I'd be pretty interested, maybe if I get a chance to interact with Kaitlyn and Schiess at all, maybe I'd ask her this question, but I'd be interested to know what did get left cut out of the book, because there could be probably quite a bit more to discuss. So that's not a critique per se, but it is something that I walked away with in terms of my reaction to the book. Overall, really, really appreciated this historical study, really appreciated the readability of it, loved the research behind it. I feel like it's very genuinely insightful. I mentioned the chapter that compares Obama to George W. Bush. Super insightful chapter. I loved her discussion of Romans 13 and the Revolutionary War period. I love that she included that chapter on the neoliberal market era. I thought that was really germane to a lot of stuff that's happening in our kind of political climate at the moment. So there's a lot in here that I think is very laudable that she discussed. I think it's a unique book in the way that it intersects history with some political theology and some exegesis of Scripture. And I really appreciated the way that she landed on Jeremiah 29 as the final discussion point of the book, in the whole posture of being in exile, and kind of her nuanced take on that. So anyways, a lot to appreciate here. She's very nuanced, well-informed, sane voice in a conversation that is increasingly less and less sane, I find. So those are my thoughts on the Ballot and the Bible. Really appreciate that it's out there. I'm glad for this chance to review it, and I hope that it gets some attention, because I think it's well worth reading, well worth your time. So if any of this sounded of interest to you, I would encourage you to pick up The Ballot and the Bible by Kaitlyn Schiess. If there's other books like this that you would recommend that kind of have similar tones and similar thoughts about the political use of Scripture in our history, I would love to know about those. But as always, thank you for watching.